welcome back to another episode of DEAP Podcast. I'm D,
And I'm Cast.
and today we'll be talking about standardized testing. And just a reminder for everyone, all topics are fair game, regardless of how sensitive they may be. So keep that in mind as you're listening, and don't be surprised if we bring up some contentious and potentially offensive topics. So with that in mind, standardized testing. Overall, what's your feel on standardized testing, Cast?
So I think that there are merits to it, but there are also major disadvantages to it from testing only on a subset of material and very specific material that may not bridge all cultures, all teaching systems, and that needs to be taken into account. Um,
And isn't that kind of by definition the goal of standardized testing? Because
right.
what's the difference between a test and a standardized test? A test is any way of measuring someone's capabilities in a particular area. A standardized test
Mhm.
is aimed at across as many peoples as possible and as many areas where you may be learning about things as possible. There's You have a test that measures standardly or to the same
Mhm.
standards across areas or across peoples.
Yep.
So
The
what go ahead.
so the main problem with standardized testing, and you're right in that it allows the same material to be tested against many different peoples on a specific topic, but the choice of topics and the choice of what's included for each topic is very relative. They can't possibly cover absolutely everything necessary. And so when you are, I'll use the example of farming. Even if there was a section on a test that was a lot about farming and farming knowledge, there is a very, very good chance that a rural area, like a rural school, would do much better on that test than an inner city school because
Sure.
those kids in the rural school, I mean, even if there was a farming class taught in both the inner city and in the rural school kids probably have a lot more hands-on experience on farms where
It,
they are
if you choose
there.
what you're saying is if you choose the standard test or the standardized test to
Mhm.
be related to a particular group's lifestyle, then you're much more likely to have some people do significantly better than other people, and that's a
Yep,
way of institutionalized unfairness. I guess
correct.
is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's bias in them based on who made the test and what they deem is most important, and then maybe what their experience is in, and they're like, "Well, I know this, so I think everyone should know that."
Sure. Do you think that there's value in standardized tests?
I think
Let
that they
let
there
let me let
is
me change
value,
let me
yes.
change the question. Do you think that there's a value in evaluating people's abilities?
Yes, primarily not so much on a to evaluate said person, but the way that I view standardized testing, and I'm gonna, I guess, put this specifically to how the American school system does a yearly standardized test to and gives it to all students, and the tests are at least supposed to be anonymous, and they are testing the students, but they are not looking to give these students a grade or tell the students that they're doing poorly.
So
What it shows
I'm
is
glad you're
on the
bringing this up
school
because it's not actually testing the students. I know the
in
tests that you're
those
talking about,
cases. Yeah.
the anonymized tests where you
Hmm.
have all students take them all basically at the same time, and they're
Hmm.
anonymized because they're not testing the capability of the students, they're testing the
Right.
capability of the teachers. What they're looking
Right.
for is across different teachers and across different
Hmm.
schools, what sorts of knowledge have the students been accruing?
Yep.
And they want to make sure that the teachers are actually teaching based on the standards that are expected, particularly out of public education, or just
Right.
to be able to maintain your status as an educational institution. So
Yep.
if your students end up doing very poorly on those tests, it may not be the students. It's
Hmm.
much more likely to be reflective of the teachers. So that's what
Or
those tests
the
are
school
actually
in
trying to do.
general.
Yes,
Yeah,
or the school in
and,
general.
like, for example, a topic such as, civics is, I believe, required, teaching for all American students to talk about what or maybe not civics and just politics in general, and like how the American government is broken up into the three branches and
Sure.
whatever.
Political
That
science,
yeah,
mathematics, readings, literature,
things
things like that.
yeah, and there are things that if we've deemed that every American child should understand how the American government works, which makes sense,
Hmm.
um, there needs to be a way to make sure that the teachers are teaching that to the students, no matter where they are in the country.
Absolutely. And I think that this is an aspect, or this is the type of test that
Hmm.
could end up being abused from both directions. So what that type of test measures is crystallized knowledge and
Yeah.
crystallized intelligence. The two main types of intelligences and knowledge are crystallized and fluid. Fluid intelligence is your ability to learn new things and accrue new knowledge. Crystallized knowledge is basically the memories that you have. So,
Hmm.
as an example, fluidic knowledge would be, what is 2 plus 2.5? I'm asking you.
4.5. Oh, 4.5.
4.5. So that's not something that you've memorized, that 2 plus 2.5 is 4.5. That's something that you're able to put together. Crystallized knowledge. Who was the first president of the United States?
George Washington.
Exactly. So that's just something that you've memorized. Fluidic knowledge is your ability to gain new crystallized knowledge.
Yeah.
The tests that measure teachers' capabilities, which are also reflective of where the students are at in terms of their capabilities, those generally are measuring crystallized knowledge. And one of the problems with that is teachers may end up just teaching to the test.
Exactly. And that's a big problem, is that teaching to the test, the idea is that let's say that there are 1,000 points of data in a certain lesson, or like
Hmm.
in a certain area that people would want to learn. So
Sure.
there are 1,000 facts about American government, and no more, no less.
And
And
let's say you have the test pulls 100 of those questions out.
right.
The teacher can just teach all 1,000 of those things and hope that the kids remember as many of them as possible, so that
Mhm.
of the randomly selected questions, they should be able to do well on them.
Right. But if the teacher knows that the focus of the test is on 100 of the 1,000 data points, then that teacher's probably only going to teach to that 100 and
But
not
what I'm
to the
saying
full
is, if
1,000.
those 100 questions are randomly selected and the teacher
Oh, yeah.
doesn't know what they are, they would
Right.
still have to teach to the 1,000. So
Correct.
that's a way around the abuse of teachers teaching to the test as opposed to
Hmm.
teaching the subject material as a whole. Is you have a swath of material that is too large that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be able to memorize, the students to be able to memorize everything, and then you randomly
Hmm.
select questions from that, so that the teachers can't just say, hey, memorize these answers to the question. And I believe that that's generally what's done, but even
Yeah.
then you're teaching towards what might be on the test as opposed to what the students maybe need to get out of the material.
Right. And ideally, I mean, what you're testing on any standardized test should be as best as possible what the students should be learning. But the thing is, I mean, with my example of 1,000 data points, no more, no less, that is, I mean, wildly low for any topic and ever. There are literally millions of different facets of how American government works, from the lowest like local tiers to city to state to county to
Right, and
all
expecting
it's
people to
so.
know all of those facets as well
Mhm.
as everything else in various types of literature, and I think let's take literature as another good example. That if you need to know certain things about particular stories and particular books and historical stories,
Mhm.
so let's say Shakespeare, who chose Shakespeare as the author that should be focused on as opposed to someone from a different culture. So that's
Mhm.
one of the arguments against that sort of testing of crystallized knowledge, is who gets to choose what knowledge should be tested against and what
Right.
knowledge should be taught. But that's not necessarily a problem with standardized testing of that material. That's a problem with determining what should be taught in the public school
Mhm.
sector.
Right. And that goes back, I can't remember, I think it was on one of the Deep Quotes episodes, we're talking about, I mean, indoctrination too, taking that into account.
Talking
That,
about public education versus private education and who should
yeah,
decide what gets taught.
Correct.
Yep. And I think that that's fair, but at the same time, the knowledge that you're going to be teaching is generally the knowledge that you are expected to know to be a functional human being, or at least a well-rounded human being in the current particular cultural context. So,
Hmm.
as cultures change, we change what's taught, um, and between cultures. If you're at a
Hmm.
public school in the UK, you're not going to be learning the same exact things as a public school in the United States, particularly in the example that you gave of government and how the
Yeah.
government functions. The things that you're learning about the government will be different in the United States versus the UK versus China.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
I
it's
mean,
up.
if I were to say it, the MP has decided that this is going to happen, I I'm slightly doubtful that most Americans would know what MP means.
The minister prime.
No, that's PM. MP means member of parliament.
All right. Yeah. And it's a perfect example where when the systems are different,
Hmm.
the education is different, but the education is shaped by the culture. And so whatever the average culture is tends to be what's ended up being taught in the educational system. A standardized
Yeah.
test is just meant to measure how well the educational system is applying that. Or at least
Hmm.
our first type of standardized test, which is testing crystallized knowledge, which is to measure teachers and measuring how well the school systems are implementing the education of the youth.
Yep.
And we've mentioned one of the problems with that, which is teaching to the test, but we've also brought up ways around that where we have a
Hmm.
pool of questions as opposed to the specific questions. And
Yeah.
that is kind of a good thing, even if they are teaching to the test. If the things that are on the test, they're deemed things that are important. So
Hmm.
it's somewhat okay if you're teaching to the test because those are the core concepts that the students should be getting out of it anyway.
Yeah. So let's keep talking about what the like a standardized testing that is testing the school, not so much the children.
Mm-hmm.
Like an so do you think funding to schools should be based on um the 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 scores
Should
that
it
the students in
should
those
it be
schools
related
receive?
to the scores that the students are
Yeah,
able to get on the tests that are trying to measure teachers' capabilities?
correct.
It's an interesting question because I think that it's inversely related. The performance of the students can both be correlated directly and
Hmm.
inversely uh, to the amount of money that they should receive. What I mean by that is if the students test better, that means that the teachers are doing a better job and you should reward them by giving them more money.
Right.
However, if the students are doing better, that means that they don't need as much help as opposed to the areas where the teachers maybe aren't as good because it
There.
doesn't pay as well. So when the students do poorly, then you should give more money. But that
Hmm.
incentivizes teachers to be worse
Right.
or tell their students, hey, I know that you've learned all the things that you should, but I want you to bomb the test
Yep.
because that means that the school will get more money and we'll be able to get more
Right.
teachers.
Yeah, and so there are, I mean, there's in the short term, it seems like a good plan to uh, direct funding to schools that need it if they're not doing well, but also to reward schools that are doing well with more funding because you're rewarding them. But it very quickly turns into a system. It's a system that they can game quite easily, either by one, teaching specifically to the test, or two, purposely having their students do poorly on the test.
Right. And,
Um,
and you can tell the students, hey, I'll give everyone a bunch of extra credit if you bomb the test because it allows us to get more money as a school, which is good in the long run. And you guys get a good grade. So who cares?
mhm. Right. And so, I mean, personally, I don't think schools should, well, I don't think it should be just set and done that says if you do well, you get more money. If you do poorly, you do more money. I think there needs to be something in place that it's almost like an audit of going in and finding out and checking why they aren't doing well
I,
in
I, I
those
think
cases.
I think in terms of public schools, that would be a
Mhm.
reasonable option, and making sure that if there's a problem with a particular teacher, looking at as an evaluation of maybe we should get a different teacher. I think one of the other benefits to it is, particularly in private schools, if you do that kind of analysis and the scores are bad,
Hmm.
that reflects poorly on the school as a whole. So making those, because it's the test results are anonymized, you can't see who got what score. Even if you anonymize the teacher groups, just say, hey, at
Right.
this school the average math score was 75. That
Yep.
reflects on the school, and people can use that in choosing which school to go to. So it's not that they will get a direct financial benefit or decrement, but if you're the choice of the students and the choice of the parents of the students will change based on what those scores are. So I think that publicizing those scores, which are testing the teacher's capabilities, are good in helping people make an educated decision on which school to send their child to. And I think that being able to make a more educated decision is only a good thing. That hiding that information prevents parents from being able to make a good decision. I think that that's bad. So those scores that are evaluating teachers should be used
Hmm.
both in evaluating whether or not you should keep those teachers or how well they should
Yeah.
be paid, but also as it should be released as public knowledge.
Right. But the thing is, I'm not certain that the way that the American school system tests work goes based on teacher. It just goes based on school and grade. Um,
I
so
think it's a
I,
mix of all of them, and
right.
it's why
I
maybe it
think
doesn't
it's
reflect specifically on the teacher. It may have to do with any number of factors, but
right.
how
But
do you?
by being able to differentiate by teacher, so let's for example talk about a department that is four different teachers. It's I'm just going to use math
Sure.
department as an example, or maths if you are in the UK. Um, so if you have four math teachers that are teaching the same grade and are supposed to be covering the same topics day in day out as each other, and if you just rate the math department as a whole, and you're basically getting an average of those four teachers. Now you can't really tell which teacher is doing well and which one's doing poorly, but if you are able to differentiate it, so you can and find out that sure, two of the teachers are about average, but one of them is far below average and the other one is far above average. It allows the school system to understand what's going on. If it's
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
I think that that's one of the big benefits of doing these types of tests is as long as you're careful about not allowing teachers to be able to abuse the system, you can it gives a positive feedback loop, or at least it gives feedback that you can take action on. And I think that that's
Mhm.
in general a good thing. Having knowledge about how to act is generally speaking a good thing, and that's something that I'm going to be bringing up later on as we're talking about more of the individual assessments. But for right now we're still talking about school stuff.
Mhm. Yeah. So going back to like the funding question, I think first and foremost, uh, the like from one year to the next, if things do poorly, instead of first saying, is it because of like did this school do better because funding, or did they do worse because they don't have enough funding? First going in and saying, well, let's take a look at what was different from last year to this year. Well, let's say in the math department, they were doing well. They were doing, about average last year. And then this year they're doing less than average. Let's not just throw money at them. Let's look at the breakdown teacher by teacher.
Yeah,
Was this
I
was a new
think that
teacher hired
while money
or
will be involved, and while
right?
maybe monetary compensation should be given to the teachers that are doing well, I don't think that you should be financially penalized for doing poorly or
Hmm.
financially rewarded. It should be a, hey, something's going on here. While the action that we may end up taking may be related to finances, we may fire the teacher.
Yep.
You know, it's not a you the money output will be directly proportional to the success of or failure of the test. I don't think
Right.
that it should be proportional. I think that it should be a case by case, looking at what the results are and seeing how to improve the teaching
Hmm.
capabilities of the school and of the teachers in general.
Right. And the other thing is that year by year, there can be fluctuations because one of the things that I feel is very necessary but often gets forgotten about is that there are different ways of teaching the same subject to students. And there are different strategies and methods, and some of them work better than others. And if a teacher decides to try a new one, that can either show as sudden improvement or maybe not so much if they're still trying, if they're working on exactly how to do it in the class. So a single year's data is not, it should not always be used. It should be, you should look at it as a trend and look for those big changes and go find out why there was a big change. So if they're suddenly doing better, it's like, well, let's go find out why they're doing better. Oh, this school just started trying this method of teaching this topic, and it definitely shows that it's worked well.
Sure.
And then look at 1 year where last year they were average and now they're far below average. Oh, they tried this thing; it doesn't seem to work well, and that by finding out what does and doesn't work well, and then kind of sharing it across, you can I guess better everyone by saying, hey, last year these strategies were found to work well,
Right.
and these ones were not.
Right. When you see an improvement in a particular area or in a particular teacher, you can use the teaching strategies of that person or department and share them with
Yeah,
the other departments in
exactly.
an attempt to improve all of the education as a whole.
You're right.
So
But simply guiding, using these to guide funding, not a good approach
right.
because
So
it then
I think that
suddenly becomes,
it sounds like we agree that just in
yeah.
education in general, one of the ways that you improve education and the educational system in general is to measure the average capabilities of the students and the changing of their capabilities over the years and across different teachers and
Hmm.
adjusting the educational system based on that. So I
Yep.
think that's a good kind of broken down axiom for public education, particularly testing students to measure the capabilities of public education and updating it accordingly. That
Hmm.
that is something that we seem to agree on, that it is necessary. And a way to do that is measuring the crystallized knowledge that the students have gained and retained, because how
Hmm.
you teach can change how much knowledge is retained. And that's a good way of just measuring the teaching capabilities of the school and of the teacher, and it gives you information to act on.
Yep.
So again, I'm trying to get it that axiom as short as possible, is that measuring a student's capabilities and all students' capabilities in a particular area, anonymizing the data to evaluate the teachers allows you to act on both good and bad aspects of the teachers, eliminating bad, increasing good between the teachers to help education. Yeah, and I think I
Yep.
just made it longer, but those are the simple components. So are we good for teacher evaluation through students? And there are other ways
Yeah.
of evaluating teachers, but I think grading a teacher by the fruit of their teachings is probably the best thing to do.
Yep.
Uh,
With I guess there and with the I'm sorry.
I have a different point to add on
Yeah.
to it. You can test a teacher's knowledge. You test the teacher for that. But the point of a teacher is to be able to transmit knowledge and
Hmm.
transmit a way of thinking. And the way that you measure that is measuring the students.
Yep.
That
And
you
the
cannot test their transmissional
mhm.
abilities by testing just the teacher. You need to test the students.
Right, exactly. And with some, I guess, wiggle room in there and understanding if a teacher is trying something new or um, like if they're trying a new method, there needs to be an understanding that, hey,
Oh,
just because they
sure,
tried a new method.
and that's something that should be
Yeah.
communicated with the school board, is saying,
Hmm.
hey, this is the method that I'm going to be using, and I'm trying something out, and that's part of the conversation that would happen before and or after uh, the kids are evaluated for the teacher's transmissional capabilities.
Hmm.
Is, hey, I was trying this new thing. It seemed to not work. That's okay. I'll do something different. But if this person has tried 5 different things and none of them have been working, then maybe they need to take action against the teacher. But that's, again, up to the school, and standardized tests that are anonymized for students. That's one way of doing it.
Hmm.
So, uh, shall we move on to measuring the students? Not necessarily
Yeah.
measuring the teachers, but students specifically.
So yeah, so like talking about the ACT or the SAT
ACT,
in
SAT,
the
and IQ
in the
tests.
US as it's done. Yeah, and IQ tests in general.
So,
Um,
and by the way, ACT and SAT, they're different formats and different
Mm-hmm.
scores, but effectively they are IQ tests.
Yep.
And
Effectively, yeah.
would you agree with that?
Yeah, they're a test of IQ on in very specific areas that um, colleges care about generally, because they're almost always used to uh, put or to for a college or university to determine whether or not they should accept a student in. If you do very poorly on the ACT or the SAT, you have a very low likelihood to be accepted into a university, whereas if you do very well, you're much higher in the consideration bracket.
Right. So let's start as flat as we can, or as low level of as we can. Uh, how do you measure IQ? And I think that's a pretty difficult question. But
Yeah.
how do you measure a person's capabilities? Or I think a better question is, are there differences in human capabilities?
Definitely.
And particularly mental capabilities. So is it just a
Mhm.
matter of telling people information and having them memorize it? And if you have memorized it, then you're good. And if you haven't memorized it, well, there may be other reasons besides your mental capabilities.
Right. And the thing, I mean, the ability to memorize something is really only one part of someone's intelligence.
Absolutely, it's,
Um,
it's being able to just learn new things and be
mhm.
exposed to new things. Memory is different than picking up on things. You can have basically no short-term memory, no long-term memory, but be able to relearn how to. Let's say you have a new type of food. You can learn how to eat that new type of food, even if the next day you don't remember what that type of food was. So there's a difference between, again, crystallized memory, or crystallized knowledge, and fluidic knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, crystallized, fluidic, and I'm not sure. Like, I'm trying to think of a good word for it, but someone's ability. So, for example, let's say whittling. It's a skill that you need to learn to. I mean, you don't need to learn. Sorry, it's a skill where you need to learn very specific muscle movements and techniques and things like that, and eventually you just do it without even
So,
knowing
so
that
that
you're.
that that's a that's a good example. Or let's say cleaning.
Mhm.
Janitorial work. Generally speaking, a person who is a lawyer, you would expect to have a higher IQ than a person who's a janitor.
Right.
And the reason behind that is uh, IQ reflects on your fluidic knowledge, your ability to learn new things, your ability to learn new facts, memorize those facts, and adjust
Mhm.
on them accordingly. Same thing. It's also very closely related to pattern recognition, which is why a lot of times on IQ tests, you're looking at analogies, you're looking at breaking down of language and pulling
Mhm.
out important components. Math is very related to that. So that's why you see those things on IQ tests, ACT and SAT. They're basically all the same thing. They're trying to measure you fluidic knowledge. Doing janitorial work doesn't require that much fluidic knowledge because, okay, you'll need to learn, how do I sweep the floor? How do I mop the floor? How do I clean this window? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But repetitive tasks like that, once they're learned and once they're memorized, they don't need to be relearned. Maybe you have a
Mhm.
slightly different shaped window and you need to relearn how to clean that, but most of the windows are going to be the same, particularly if you're going back and doing it over and over and over again. That's
Right.
why also factory workers, or the factory working in a factory, generally speaking, or on an assembly line, tends to be simpler, along with janitorial work, cleaning, a lot of fast food stuff that it can't quite be automated, or it is easier to have a person do it than to go through the trouble of automating it. That doesn't require much fluidic knowledge, so that's why people that have a lower IQ tend to be there, because that's something that fits with their capabilities.
Mhm.
Whereas being a lawyer, you need to understand and be able to very quickly interpret new information and, like, oh, I just found this person did this action. I need to go start looking through and find a law that is related to the particular action that that person carried out, and interpret how to maneuver through the case to get the way that I want, or get the result that I want. So that requires a lot of fluidic knowledge, which
Mhm.
is why we see IQ related to the profession that a person ends up going into.
Yeah.
Now, I think an argument against that is, Well, let's say I'm stuck as being a janitor, but I'm actually really smart. Isn't that just couldn't that just be institutional suppression?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so, for instance, a caste system, whether it's explicit or inexplicit, having a caste system, no, not a U system, having a like what India has had for quite a long time, historically, where some people are expected to do certain actions or stick to certain jobs. If there is that sort of differentiation, could it just be systemic?
Yeah, definitely it could be.
Or
And
at least I think it being systemic could be a portion of it. So if there is some sort of institutionalized racism, which is a term that's fairly common nowadays, uh, that can indeed hurt people. But at the same time, let's say you have high fluidic intelligence and a high IQ, you would probably be smart enough to recognize the opportunities and recognize things that will hurt your chances and things that will help your chances of getting out of those. So while it may be somewhat difficult to escape from those suppressed situations or escape from a simple job, because generally the simpler the job, the less money you're going to be making, while there is an institutional component to that, having a high intelligence increases your likelihood of getting out of that. And it increases your likelihood of getting out of simple jobs very, very quickly, because fluidic knowledge allows you to take in new information and recognize the opportunities. And recognizing opportunities is, I would argue, the fastest way of getting out of a bad situation, or not necessarily a bad situation. I keep saying that. A situation that is less preferable than another. So for instance, janitorial work, if you want to make more money and you believe that you can, that mean if you are smart enough to get out of that, kind of by definition, you'll be able to get out of that. If you don't, if you have an intelligence level that is just enough to do janitorial work and not much more, you probably won't be able to recognize the opportunities to get above that.
So there may be a mental limitation for someone that where they can't get into one of those more critical thinking jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there are definitely people that are doing janitorial work, not because they don't have those critical thinking skills, but maybe they came from a family that was not very well off and could not afford to send them to college. So instead, they became a janitor, and they
Sure,
ended up
and perhaps
maybe enjoying that. And
perhaps you're an absolute genius, and you're able to, if you were given all of the information for quantum mechanics, then maybe you would be able to solve one of the bleeding edge problems
right.
in quantum mechanics or in physics or in anything in computing.
But
And
if you were never given that, or never given the opportunity to absorb that knowledge in a like in a way, like from a
right, it
teacher or from a mentor or something like that, it's you just may never know that you are
right.
really good at conceptualizing quantum mechanics.
Having a lot of fluidic knowledge, I guess, could be compared to being a very absorbent sponge. That when you're presented with new information, then you're able to absorb more and more and more knowledge very, very quickly, as opposed to having low fluidic knowledge or having low IQ means that even if you're presented with new information, you can't absorb it. So you're more like maybe a rock that you can absorb some, like dumb as a rock. You can absorb some knowledge, like rocks can get wet, but they're not going to hold as much water as a sponge.
Right.
So hey, you're as smart as a sponge. So
sea sponges have decentralized neural systems.
Interesting tidbit. So I think that there are people that would disagree with that, though, and so I'll try and argue on their behalf of that.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm going to share a quote from Dr. Jordan Peterson, which is, quote, "One of the things that has bothered me about the left and the right is the right tends to think, well, if you just got your act together and worked hard, you can make it. And the left tends to think everybody is the same, and if you remove systemic impediments, then everybody could do whatever they needed to do. The left is wrong because there is real diversity of ability, but the right is wrong because there is real diversity of ability." End quote. And I think that there's something to be said there that, yes, there are going to be systemic impediments, but yes, there are also real differences between people's capabilities.
hmm And some of those differences between people's capabilities actually do stem from systemic things in ways that a lot that may not be realized. So if we were to do a test on the ability to tell time, just like put someone in the room, wait a certain amount of time, and then ask them, how long do you think you were in that room?
Hmm. That changes
What
based on age.
It changes based on age, but it actually changes massively based on culture. So there have been studies done that have shown that in like rural areas of Europe or rural areas of Africa where people are not exposed to clocks or like accurate time telling devices very often, they often have a very poor sense of how much time is passing at any given time. It's like
And that
you put them in the room and for 15 minutes and you say, how long were you in there? And they're like, I've no idea.
no, I think that that's a measurement of crystallized knowledge, because as you as you have the passage of time, if we're based on clocks and we watch clocks all the time and we're used to saying this is approximately how 15 minutes is, the fluidic knowledge would be, how well can I learn how much time is passing based on feeling? And
Mhm.
that's more of a memory of, hey, I know the feeling of how long 15 minutes is. It hasn't
Right.
been that long, so I'm going to guess 10. So I think that that's a comparison of crystallized knowledge as opposed to fluidic.
Well, yeah, and to an extent, and then it also needs to be taken into account what that person might be doing, or maybe even what they're thinking about. I know that if I'm thinking about a subject that I have a lot of interest in, I'm like thinking through a problem that I was presented with the day before,
Mm-hmm.
my time is probably going to go by a lot quicker to me than if I didn't have something that was
It,
kind of
if,
pulling my attention.
if I found out an hour before I was going to go take an ACT that my girlfriend or my wife cheated on me, that
Mhm.
will affect my ability to concentrate on the test and will affect the
Oh yeah,
results.
yep, definitely. So there are like you always have to take into like there it has to be. I don't know what that would be,
You
but there.
basically, you should be able to retake the test, because taking it at different times allows you to eliminate as many possible variables, like did you sleep
Mhm.
well, did something bad happen recently.
Yeah.
It allows you to eliminate more and more of the interfering variables. And the ideal test is a test that is consistent across takings of the test, and that is what ACTs, SATs, and IQ tests
Yep.
aim to do, is be as consistent as possible. And one of the ways that they're measured is if you have the same person take the same test on different days and under different scenarios, the test is viewed as better if it's more consistent, which is where the questions are pulled from. That's how what questions are on the test are determined, is what questions are effective at being consistent between
hmm
the same person taking the test at different times.
Yep. Yeah, and that's fair. Um, so on the topic of taking the same test multiple times, I happen to know that for the ACT, I believe you can take it up to 10 times. But if you are applying to a university and you are using that as a measure, different universities look at things different ways. Like, for example, some university might just say, I will take the test that they did the best on out of their 10 attempts, and we're going to use that. Whereas another university might say, I want to take the average of all of their tests
Yep.
and use that. And then
So
some of them might pick and choose and say, well, on this test, they did the best at in the math section, so we're going to use the score from that.
sure,
Whereas on this test, they did the best in reading, and
sure.
we're going to take the highest of all, and or along those lines.
So
Um,
let's look at each of those.
mhm.
The different extremes are take an average of all the tests versus taking just the best scores of all of the tests.
Mhm.
What's a benefit of taking just the best scores?
Generally, you can see improvement. I mean, if someone takes the test 10 times, I would hope that they take it once and they go and study they've
So
realized
that's a different thing. Looking at the progression of the test scores over time. So if the test scores
yeah.
decrease, that may mean that the harder you try, the worse you do.
Mhm.
Whereas if they increase, then maybe you can see, okay, well, how does this person improve? But generally speaking, I don't think that most universities or organizations are going to be looking at a person's growth capabilities by looking at multiple ACTs, because most people are not going to be taking it 10 times. So that's not a consistent piece of information that people will be able to get.
Yeah.
I think that let's just focus on taking the best scores, or maybe looking at the best scores and the worst scores. I think that there's some validity to that, because you see what is the peak capability that this person can output. Not just what is the average capability, but what is their peak output. If you're looking for someone that is a decent enough worker but can occasionally output an amazing work, if that's what you're looking for, then maybe, you should just be looking at what the peak numbers are, not what the average numbers are. But if you're looking at ACT and SAT scores, that's kind of against what the ACT and SAT are going for. Or I'm just going to start referring to them as IQ tests in general. An IQ test is aimed at getting your averaging all of your different intellectual aspects into one score. And so if you take an IQ test, which is trying to average things, and you take it 10 times, the average of those 10 times is the most representative average of the IQ tests.
Yeah.
So shouldn't that be used?
I mean, I think there's an argument for that. Yeah, and basically what you just said is you get the average of all of their attempts, and so, I mean, if someone really is doing a progression where they do maybe not so great on the first test, and the second test and third test they just do slightly better, and you take an average of those, with each attempt that they take, if they do better, they're bringing their average up, so it looks better.
Assuming that they're improving, but they may not improve. And statistically speaking, again, the way that IQ tests are designed is to eliminate as many factors as possible. And so if you're taking it multiple times, it should only increase the consistency with which your IQ is measured.
Correct. To an extent. I mean, so I will use the example of, there was something that when I took the ACT, and used that to continue my education. The thing about the ACT is, though, I was taking a lot of practice tests beforehand. I was working to do as best as I could on the ACT by understanding what they are, I guess, looking for and testing for. And I was taking the practice exams, and I was doing all right. Like, I was doing above average, and I was like, this isn't a bad score. This is probably going to get me into whatever school the schools I was looking at the time.
Yep.
But I think some of my lowest score, one of my lowest scores was like grammar.
Okay.
And I think some of the questions were along the lines of, which of, like, we start the statement like this, which of these 4 possible ways to end the statement is most valid?
Yep.
And I just kept getting tripped up on them because they were all very close to being valid statements. And I was getting tripped up on them on all the practice tests. And then at one point I was talking with my teacher about it. He's like, if you don't know the right answer, pick the one that is the shortest. That is almost always the right answer.
Interesting.
And I did that, and my scores on the practice exams and tests went way up. And that was something, it was like, if he hadn't told me that
to be fair, though, the reason that may be true may not be specific to the test. It may be specific to the linguistic patterns. Linguistic patterns aim to communicate as much possible information in as short of a time frame as possible. So generally speaking, in linguistic rules, the shorter answer, or the shorter the statement, the more accurate it is, and the less likely it is to have a grammatical error. So I don't think that that's necessarily a test measurement. It's just a truth about how linguistics works. And particularly in the language and grammar sections, your ability to recognize linguistic patterns is very important and related to your intelligence. The more intelligent you are, the more capable you are of understanding linguistic ideas. If you're able to listen to this podcast and understand all of the ideas the first time around, great. There are going to be some people out there, probably a lot of people out there, that can listen to this podcast multiple times and not be able to track the ideas as we're progressing through them. We've been talking right now for around 45 minutes, which means that there's 45 minutes worth of knowledge that a person has to be able to keep track of. Not everyone can do that, particularly as you get significantly older. Your ability to follow ideas and remember back, both in terms of long-term and short-term, decreases.
Yep.
So,
and I mean, taking a peek behind the curtain, I know that there are definitely times where I'm saying something and or you're saying something and the other one of us may not follow it perfectly the first time around. I mean, it's just a part of any sort of conversation that trying to take thoughts and turn them into words, you can't always do so accurately. So asking clarifying points, and maybe you
right,
think they said
but being able to identify what to ask to find those clarifying points is part of representing what your intelligence level is.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
And going back to the test in general, it's trying to recognize your ability to construct and determine what the next step in a pattern is. That the harder the question, the harder the pattern is to recognize. And the questions that are used are ones that on test audiences are most able to, are most closely correlated with your capabilities. So in other words, if you have someone with a lot of mental capabilities and someone with little capabilities, you would expect the test to output high and low results respectively. So the way that IQ tests are put together is you make a bunch of questions. You give selections of those questions to as many people as possible. If there is one question that if you get it wrong, that on average, everyone that got it wrong got a low score, that means that question is correlated with the score, which means it is reflective of your mental capabilities. On the flip side, if everyone that got a particular question right got a high score and everyone that got it wrong got a low score, that means that question is correlated with having a high intelligence, and it's correlated with the results of the test. And that's what you're looking for, is how well do the questions correlate with the results of the test, and that's how those questions are formulated. So it's as valid of a test of measuring a person's intellectual capabilities as you can get, because the whole way that it's constructed is just, in general, if a person does well on this test, what are the questions that agree with their capabilities?
Right. I mean, but some that is assuming that everyone perfectly understands every question.
No, it doesn't, because if you don't understand any of the questions, and let's say you get all of them wrong, like you can't get a question right, but there are people that can get them right, that means that in general you are not as capable as the other people, which will give you a lower score.
Well,
and when you compare between the different people taking that test, if everyone that gets the questions wrong, that gets all of the questions wrong, they're not going to really have much of a say in what questions go into the test. People who get the questions right might. That you have to get some questions right to be able to affect the test.
Well, what I'm saying is that, let's say there's a question that comes up and it uses a specific word or a name that is common in one part of the country and not so common in another part of the country. And knowing that that word and how it's used in your part of the country.
In general, that doesn't apply to IQ tests, because IQ tests are not aimed at testing crystallized knowledge. They're aimed at testing fluidic knowledge, your ability to gain new information. Some of the questions that I remember having gone through some of these tests were talking about bird populations and effects on food chains. It's like, I've never learned about, or at least I don't remember specifically learning about a particular bird population's effect on the food chain, but graphs were associated with that question, and the question was not testing my knowledge on birds. The question was testing my ability to interpret the information in those charts and the language in the question to extract out what are interpretations from these graphs that I can gather. Because if the graphs are saying that as bird population increases, food supply goes down, if that's what they're saying and I can't extract out that information, then that's a reflective of my fluidic knowledge because it was new information given to me that I needed to try and interpret. And that's what IQ tests are built to do, is present you with the information that's necessary to get the correct answer and not look at, have you just memorized everything?
Mm-hmm.
That those are the ways that the questions are intended to be formulated.
Yeah.
And in terms of their validity, some people, there's controversy over, well, are intelligence tests or IQ tests relevant, or should they be used? IQ tests, in terms of psychological accuracy, are the most accurate psychological test we have. That in terms of determining clinical depression and determining other psychosis, basically any measurement of a person's mental capabilities or a person's mental state, the test that has historically been the most accurate and reflective of a person's capabilities and a person's mental state are IQ tests, because they remove as much bias as is possible or has been possible based on how we've done any sort of mental testing. And because of that, because they eliminate as much of the bias as possible, they tend to be, or are, the most accurate psychological measurement tool that we have in the field of psychology. So if we throw out IQ tests, consequently, we would have to throw out all less accurate tests as well, which would basically be the rest of psychology.
So do you think in terms of not crystallized knowledge, the fluidic knowledge, drawing corollaries is an important aspect of that?
Your ability to compare two things, whether or not they are alike, is an important aspect of fluidic knowledge. Yes.
So if I were to ask you something like a runner is to a marathon as a regatta is to a blank, that is testing definite fluidic knowledge, but it's also got inherent crystallized knowledge in it. That
assuming that I know what a regatta is.
Right. And
which, by the way, I don't.
So exactly. And I mean, I happen to know that you're not from an area where that term really comes up too much.
Sure.
But that is an example of where the place where you have been, or like the place where you grew up or where you learned, like, sure, there's fluidic knowledge there, but you need that crystallized knowledge, and you need there's bias there for people that grew up in a rowing community.
So that's one of the reasons, though, that on IQ tests, or at least for instance on the ACT, if you don't answer a question, it doesn't count against you. So if I didn't know what a regatta is, I have no way of answering that question appropriately.
On the ACT, you get penalized for not answering a question. On the SAT is the one that you don't get penalized for not answering a question. You also on the ACT, you are expected to answer every question, because not answering is the same as getting it wrong. Whereas on the SAT, answering a question correctly gives you points. Not answering a question does nothing, and then answering a question wrong takes away points. Okay. So there is a difference there. My mistake. Yeah. So that is an example that says, like, that in that case, it's even if you are testing fluidic knowledge, there are going to be some biases based on the inherent crystallized knowledge that you need to, I guess, understand the situation.
Now, part of that, though, is also measuring your, for instance, regatta is probably a term that would not be used around where I'm from. You use tests that are related as much as possible to the culture in which the test is aimed at testing people. So you would use terms that you would expect people to know, or at least most people to know. The higher your fluidic intelligence, the more knowledge you're going to be accruing, and the more crystallized knowledge you'll have because of the fluidic knowledge. Your ability to absorb new information means you will have more information going into the test. So while the test aims at measuring my fluidic intelligence and ability to compare two different things, it is an increased likelihood that I'll know what both of those things are before the question is even asked if I have a higher fluidic intelligence, because that means that I will have accrued that knowledge beforehand. So measuring fluidic knowledge can still be done by measuring crystallized knowledge. If I'm a really, really, really smart person, but I live in a cabin for my entire life and just food magically appears and I eat the food, I'm probably not going to have much of that crystallized intelligence, even if I'm really, really smart. So an IQ test would not be as accurate to me because it's based on where we expect the average of the population to be. If I've been living in a hut, I will be below average in terms of the population, in terms of mental capabilities, and that is most reflective. IQ is most reflective of that. It may not be perfectly accurate.
That's the important part.
Go ahead.
It is. You're entirely. It's entirely based on what the test is testing. On average, people across the country will know a certain amount of math, a certain amount of English, and a certain amount of whatever else they're testing on.
Sure.
But if you are being tested against that, and you are someone that's lived in a hut and survived on your own for the most part, you're going to do very poorly on that. Yes, your IQ will be lower in terms of what an IQ really is. But the thing is if you are an expert in identifying wild fruits and veggies and berries and things, you're going to that's what you're really good at. That's what you need to survive. That's what you need to continue living.
Sure.
Being able to identify, like looking up at the sky and finding patterns that show that, oh, it's probably going to rain later because this looks like that.
But again, we're looking at a specific person. Most of society, at least in the developed world, is not spending all their time picking berries. So measuring your capabilities to discern between two different types of berries isn't reflective of a generalized intelligence. Your fluidic intelligence will determine where you're at in a society and how much knowledge you have in a particular society. So IQ tests are designed around the society in which they exist. So a person taking an IQ test in 1900 is not going to get the same score as if they're taking an IQ test in 2000. Did I say the numbers right? 1900 versus 2000?
No.
Anyway, 100 years difference, you're going to get a different result because the IQ tests will have changed along with the culture. But that's one of the ways that IQ is measured. And for those that aren't aware, an average IQ is 100. That does not change because
for your age. Age group.
Just over time, that does not change. It gets updated with the culture. As the IQ tests change and as things get harder and you expect more knowledge, the average, that 100 score, will change. So if I got a 100 10 years ago, that does not necessarily mean that me getting the same score on that test would result in a 100 today, because it's a moving average of the population. What an IQ test does, it measures your capabilities in relation to the rest of the population. And that's where the crystallized knowledge as a component of the test, for instance, word recognition, is, well, what words would the average population recognize? If the average population, to bring back the question that you asked me earlier about a regatta, if 99% of the population where the IQ test is being distributed doesn't know what regatta is, then that question won't correlate strongly to the results of the test, and it will get thrown out in the process of making the IQ test. If on average, most people that result in that question being correlated with the results of the test. So if I get it right, then my score is higher. That means that it correlates. If I get it wrong and my score tends to be lower based on all the other questions, then it's correlated. But if on average across all the people taking the test when you're making it, if a particular question is just random on whether or not it's correlated with the general results of the test, it's going to be thrown out. So you get rid of questions based on the culture in which it's based, because it's used to compare your mental capabilities to the mental capabilities of those around you. Now, that being said, if I'm comparing my own mental capabilities, and let's say I grew up on a farm, to someone who is in the inner city. Someone in the inner city may have access to a lot more information than I did. And so then they would score higher on an IQ test, because while we are being compared as fairly as possible, it's as fairly as possible across drastically different types of lifestyles. And that's where a difference is unduly manifested. But even if there's an unduly manifested difference, it's not a difference in the test. It's not inherent necessarily to the test. The test can do as good of a job as possible identifying those differences, but that can only be so good. And I think that that's where a lot of people get tripped up on IQ tests. While IQ tests are not perfect, and they may not be able to fairly compare the ability of a farmer to the ability of a lawyer in a dense city, there's really no test that can fairly do it, or at least the test that we have that best compares is the IQ test. That all other tests will not be consistent in those comparisons, and IQ test will be consistent. That's the aim anyway.
Yeah, and that you're right that's the aim. And yeah, really what I was getting at earlier, and I think it plays a lot into this, is if you are testing fluidic knowledge and not crystallized knowledge, you need a certain amount of crystallized knowledge to understand the context of the question.
Absolutely.
So that you can answer it using your fluidic knowledge.
Absolutely, but the amount of crystallized knowledge that you have is dependent on your fluidic knowledge. That the higher your IQ in general, the better your capability of acquiring and interpreting new knowledge, the more knowledge you will generally have. The exception to that is if you have long-term memory problems, which is not all that common. There are people with memory problems, but again, that does reflect on your ability to interact with the world.
But there are savants that can memorize huge swaths of information, but when asked to use that information to determine more information, fail very, very quickly and are unable to do anything. So they have a massive amount of crystallized knowledge, but their ability to take that use it as fluidic knowledge.
And generally speaking, when you have savants like that can memorize 30,000 digits of pi, sure, they can do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be able to do well on an IQ test, because an IQ test is aimed at testing your ability to accrue new knowledge, not necessarily the specifics of what's memorized.
Yeah. And so what I'm trying to get at is...
And by the way, those are edge cases, and that's not what IQ tests are aimed at determining. IQ tests are aimed at determining how you compare to the average.
Mm-hmm. This is fair. Yeah. I think I've made my point, and I think you've made your point, and I do see what you're getting at. And I do
also acknowledge that, it may be unfair to compare people to each other. So should we discuss that? Just comparing people to each other.
So comparing people to each other, there is there are problems there. It kind of needs to happen in many situations.
And I think that to use a phrase that I think you've been kind of making the point of is, if you measure a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its entire life believing it's inadequate.
Yep.
And that's fair, but we're not measuring individual fish. If we're trying to take
the average fish is terrible climbing a tree.
Right, but
all fish are stupid.
The equivalent would be of an IQ test is saying all fish swim.
Mm-hmm.
How well do different fish swim? And that is a piece of information that could be useful to have, is how well does a particular fish swim? And so if there are questions that you ask, for instance, how well can they turn? How fast can they go? How quickly can they react to things? If you make measurements of different types of fish, and we'll just keep going with this example. If you make those types of measurements, or take various random measurements and get data inputs, and you correlate them to say, does this relate to the raw statistics of how fast they are, how well they can turn, how fast they can react? If the ways that you are testing don't correlate to those capabilities of the fish, then you don't use those data points. But again, we are developing the test based on the question. So if we're developing a test of how well can a fish climb a tree, okay, we can do that, but there's really no reason to do that. The reason that we're creating IQ tests isn't to try and make fun of fish or say that fish are useless. We're trying to be able to compare a relatively similar population. I think you would agree that monkeys would be better at climbing trees than fish. When we're comparing people and humans that all live in a single culture or a cultural area, we are not comparing monkeys to fish. We are comparing people that are generally similar, and we want to see where the differences lie. And that's what an IQ test does, is it determines where those differences are, or where you sit in those generalized intellectual capability differences.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree that the problem with the next point I want to make is that if you have a group of people taking the ACT so that they can get into college, and a college is primarily looking at ACT score first to determine if they should let someone in, and then looking at other criteria next. There needs to be some thought about, well, what is this person actually coming to the school to do? Are they going to be, are they taking a degree that maybe that requires more of that crystallized knowledge or the ability to pick up crystallized knowledge?
For instance, maybe trade schools versus law school.
Well, so I guess that's not exactly the comparison that I'm trying to get. I'm thinking about one university that has many different programs but a single admissions department. And so this university might have an art degree that is capable or possible, and a degree in physics or something along those lines. The tests necessary to get into the school, at first and foremost, you look at ACT score and then go after that if that is good enough. Now, someone that is entirely focused on art and that's what they want to do with their life may not have a great ACT score. But if they were to be tested on their ability to learn or their existing skills for what they want to get into and do, then I guess it's more fair to how they're going to continue in their education.
Sure. That, and this is not to say that artists are stupid, by no means.
No.
It's to say that you wouldn't expect to measure an artist in the same way that you would measure a physicist.
Correct. Or someone that's aspiring to be an artist compared to someone that's aspiring to be a physicist.
Sure.
You would probably you would want someone that's aspiring to be a physicist to be able to, looking at the ACT, do better on the science and the math section, because those are incredibly important.
But I think in general, if you have a school that's looking at teaching the best of the best folks in physics, they're not going to also be as dedicated to teaching the arts, because they're aimed at different aspects of humanity.
But I mean, schools exist that are teaching all these wildly different degrees. I mean, a lot
Sure, but even then, your ability to be artistic, or specifically if you're going to a university, the intent is to learn. And if IQ tests judge your capabilities of both how much knowledge you have, which is also reflective of your capabilities of learning throughout your entire life, and the test is aimed at judging your ability to take on new information and interpret that information. If you're going to university to learn about art, it's fair to expect that you would be able to interpret the new information that's being presented to you. So even an art school could use IQ measurements fairly in determining who they should let in. Because if a person has a very low IQ, or the best test that we have been able to come up with of measuring intellectual capabilities, if that says that this person is not good at accruing new knowledge, then it will take longer for them to be able to go through the course. And this is just something that unfortunately is true in people. If someone's really, really smart, you can say, hey, take this brush. move it in this way, and just keep doing that until you get a like move it straight down, move it straight right, and I want you to draw a perfect corner because that's important for the next lesson that we're going to have in doing painting. Some people will really struggle with that. There are, in the low IQ areas of society, that's something that you could tell someone and they may just look at you like, I didn't understand what you just told me. I need you to show me because I can't translate the words into an action. Show me, and then maybe I'll be able to do it. And so what takes one person 30 seconds to learn that is high IQ may take someone with a low IQ 30 minutes to learn. So go ahead.
I'm going to even use a more wildly different degree example to try to break out of the, I guess, even the existing simulators. Somebody that is majoring in art history versus someone majoring in physics.
Okay.
If you're majoring in art history, it is almost entirely crystallized knowledge that you are attempting to pick up. There isn't really much room for that the critical thinking aspect. You learn this is the history of art. This is how this artist painted. This is how this other artist painted. These were the aspects of their life on all of these things. It's like you might be asked the question, well, what is like there's this situation, what does it sound closest to? Which artist does it sound closest to?
Sure.
But that really does come down to crystallized knowledge.
The ability to accrue that new crystallized knowledge is what fluidic knowledge is, and that's what IQ tests are aimed at determining.
I'm going to go back to the edge case example of a savant. Not necessarily. You can be really good at picking up crystallized knowledge, but having very poor fluidic knowledge to use.
But by definition, fluidic knowledge is your ability to accrue new knowledge.
Then I disagree with that definition, or I disagree with our use of the term in this case.
And how would you determine it, or how would you? How would you define different types of knowledge?
I would look at it as like fact-based and critical thinking-based, where facts are known values that you pick up, and then critical thinking is how you use your existing knowledge to solve a situation, or to how do you apply that knowledge to a specific situation as well as you can. So if I say if I'm trying to think of a good example here of some raw facts and how they might be used. So if I were to talk to you about the different fish, fin styles and fin shapes of different fish, it's one thing to know that these different fish have different style fins, and you've memorized that. Now, if someone were to say, well, why do you think that is? You may know a lot about fish, and you may know a lot about their different fin shapes just because you've memorized it. But someone that isn't as good at critical thinking could very easily get lost on a question like, well, why? Where someone that is better at critical thinking would maybe think along the lines of, well, I know this fish has this style of fin, and their main purpose is this. So
a savant will be able to have a lot of knowledge, accrue new knowledge quickly, but not necessarily be able to compare that knowledge.
Correct. Or apply it in situations that isn't just reciting it.
But I think you would agree that a savant is someone who is extraordinary in terms of the most of the population. And in general, what we've found is that your fluidic knowledge, your ability to accrue new knowledge, is very closely correlated with your ability to act on that knowledge. And because determining, there are two different types of fish with different types of fin. I can learn that, and if I can learn that very quickly and recognize the differences between the two fins, I can probably come up with a reason that those two fins would be different, because I can recognize this has a different shape, it probably has a different function, and I can start making guesses at the function. And just the fact that I'm making guesses at the function is reflective of what my intelligence is. So
Yeah.
Yes, while there are exceptions to the rule, generally speaking, your ability to accrue new knowledge and interpret new knowledge means that you are interpreting knowledge. So,
mhm.
interpreting things that are presented to you is related to your ability to interpret those things once they're accrued.
Yeah. So really what I was trying to get at with the savant idea is that not so much to say these are the only the this is an exception and why we need to make the exception the rule, and it's not what I'm getting at. What I'm trying to show and talk through is that by the savant is really just my example of that savant is really just one boundary of the spectrum that is the of this. And there are two different spectrums here. There's the spectrum of your ability to learn new knowledge and just memorize it, and there's the your ability to apply it in a critical way
But I think what
and
you're
apply
you're more
existing
getting at
knowledge.
is that there are different types of intelligences, or there
Yeah.
are different types of capabilities that are related to mental faculties.
Hmm.
So, for instance, reaction time may be one, maybe
Yeah.
ability of to recognize emotions. So you can have very smart people that
Yeah,
can't that
that's like
are
EQ.
or face blindness is another thing.
Yeah.
That people
Yeah.
just can't recognize faces or maybe can't recognize voices. So there are different aspects to it. But in general, I think what standardized tests and particularly IQ tests aim to measure is your general capability to accrue new knowledge. And
Not, no, I would not fully agree with that. I think it's your ability to apply knowledge. That's it, they primarily, at least how I've always thought about them, is your ability to your critical thinking skills, your ability to take a certain scenario and then consider through it and come up with new knowledge and come up with an answer that was not explicitly in this statement, nor is it something you've ever explicitly learned,
but
but
if you're just
taking
looking at
existing
applying
knowledges.
knowledge, that's more what trade schools and trade tests are aimed at.
Hmm.
Of saying, hey, you've been through the schooling, you should have the knowledge, apply that knowledge. So, for instance, mastery tests.
Hmm.
Or are you familiar with what a masterpiece is originally?
Yeah.
A
Yes.
masterpiece is, for those that don't know, is a piece of art or something being produced by an apprentice that, assuming that it comes out as it is expected by the master that's teaching them, if it makes the quality that's expected, then they are no longer considered an apprentice, they're considered a master. So it's the piece that
Mhm.
made you a master. That's a way of measuring the accrued knowledge and the crystallized knowledge that you have, but you need to be able to apply that by converting that crystallized knowledge into action. But that's not what IQ tests measure. That's not what standardized tests measure, because otherwise we would expect certain crystallized knowledge to be there to measure your application of it. You are presented in IQ tests with new concepts, or at least ways of applying them, but also the concepts that are necessary to be applied. It's
Mhm.
not just the application of a concept, the crystallized knowledge that you need for it is frequently applied. Like the example that I brought up earlier of birds and their effect on food chain. I didn't need to have the crystallized knowledge to be able to interpret the graphs, because that's what it was
Mhm.
measuring my ability to do, is read different types of information, my ability to read graphs, my ability to recognize patterns, my ability to recognize linguistic patterns like you had mentioned. It doesn't
Mhm.
the content of the sentence or the content of the graphs doesn't matter. It's my ability to interpret that information and then take an action on it, not just taking an action on it, because I think what you're talking about is more of the masterpiece type tests, which are
To an
also
extent.
relevant, but that's
Yeah, and I
measuring your crystallized knowledge.
to an extent. I mean, there are. I mean, in any sort of a masterpiece, let's say sculpting, you learn a lot of different techniques and you learn a lot of different things. And then, for example, your masterpiece might be you're given a piece of marble of a certain variety, and you've never worked with before, taking the knowledge that you've gained and applying that so that you can best sculpt this marble.
hmm
Um,
But again, even that is very closely related to IQ and your average
mhm.
intelligence. If in order to sculpt marble, I
Mhm.
need, let's say, 20 various types of techniques. For a particular masterpiece, I need to call upon 20 different types of techniques. If I'm not very smart, I would not be able to do that. I would not be able to know which techniques to apply where, or if I did, it might take me, if I have a low level of intelligence, it might take me 50 years to accrue that knowledge. So if someone, let's say that someone creates a masterpiece and they prove, and a masterpiece is kind of a version of an IQ test is where I'm getting at, is that if it takes you 50 years to be able to create a masterpiece, that's reflective of your intelligence. If you are able to do it when you're 25, you become an adult and after a few years you're able to accrue the knowledge necessary to make a masterpiece, that is reflective of your generalized intelligence because you've been able to gain the knowledge, gain those tools, and know how to apply them to make your masterpiece. So even if you're testing applied knowledge, you're still testing your ability to gather that applied knowledge or gather that crystallized knowledge, and your ability to apply it is directly correlated with your general intellectual capabilities. If you are really, really stupid, you don't know what actions to take in different situations. And this is what I'm getting at, is that IQ in general is just the generalized measure of your ability to act and learn on things. That acting on things and learning on things is the same thing because you learn how to act based on previous experiences. And so if you don't know how to act in the test, it's because you haven't learned how to act previously.
Yeah. And so now that I understand, I think now very clearly where you're getting at. And I think you summarized my point earlier better than I have been able to thus far, is that I'm primarily talking about different types of intelligence rather than the point of an IQ test. And an IQ test is to test one of those types of intelligence.
No,
You're
it's
right.
not. It's intended to test average intellectual capability. Which is why
specific place, which is your fluidic knowledge, as you've been calling.
It's not to say, hey, have you memorized all of the presidents of the United States? It's looking at your ability to act and interpret the knowledge. Gain, interpret, and act on knowledge. That those are all one component of thinking. Let me rephrase. Gaining new knowledge is something that you need to be able to do. Interpreting that knowledge is something you need to be able to do, and acting on that knowledge is something you need to be able to do. But all three of those are effectively the same when it comes to having intelligence. More intelligent people will be better at all three of those things with very few exceptions. There are people that may just be able to memorize everything, but it'll take them forever to memorize it, but they'll never forget it. There are people like that. But generally speaking, in humans, all three of those things are closely related. And when you can't separate them scientifically, when you try to create a test that measures one but doesn't measure the other, we have not really been able to do that. That it measures all three simultaneously because of how closely they're correlated. So I think while you're right in saying that they are technically different a little bit, they are correlated very highly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is definitely correlation.
And there's going to be differences between
being better in one aspect than the others.
And there's going to be differences between people. So, some people are going to be slightly better at acting on things and maybe not as good at learning them. But generally speaking, most people, those three aspects are very closely correlated.
Yeah, they're related and correlated for the most people. So,
right.
Yeah, I agree.
And so the point that I've been making with IQ tests is that IQ tests and standardized tests aim at measuring all three of those, and that those three are reflective of fluidic knowledge. Your ability to gain knowledge, your ability to interpret, and your ability to act are really all one and the same thing. They're different aspects of thinking, but it's still thinking in general and not just raw knowledge, which is crystallized knowledge, which is why I'm saying that fluidic knowledge, while it encompasses multiple aspects of thinking, those aspects of thinking are correlated with each other, which is why IQ tests try to just boil it down, and the way that they're created is by only measuring things that are correlated.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
Shall we? I think that we're actually finally in agreement on that. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think I would agree with that.
Okay. So let's move into the contentious bit.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that IQ tests are accurate in measuring a person's capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Should you be able to use that to determine whether or not a person is fit for doing a particular activity? For a top-down decision. Not just
a pure IQ test.
Go ahead.
A pure IQ test that is not based in any prior knowledge, but pure that is somehow been designed that no matter what your previous,
let's say it's as good as possible. Let's say that IQ tests actually do measure what your IQ is.
No matter what situation and where you come from, it is so perfect that you can take two humans from any part of the earth, no matter what their life up to that point has been. This test will test their ability to absorb new knowledge, evaluate that knowledge, and then apply that knowledge. So it's a perfect test like that.
Let's say it's a perfect test. Is it fair? Or should that be used in determining where people should go? Because one of the big negatives of that is, let's say you can accurately measure a person's knowledge, and let's say it is perfect. You would obviously want the best of the best. Generally speaking, if you are looking for a janitor, you're not going to look for someone who is the smartest person in the world, because they should be doing something better with their lives, and you would expect them to do a much better job, and you'd probably end up needing to pay them more to do the job. And again, I'm coming from a capitalist perspective on this, but you would want to find someone who fits the job as well as possible.
Right.
But if you do that, there will be people that don't fit jobs.
Yes.
There are people out there that can't really do much of anything. They
can be very smart but not be able to function.
No, I'm saying so. As an example, the United States military. You are not allowed to be inducted into the military if you have an IQ measured below about 83.
Mm-hmm.
For reference, that's about 10% of the population. So for the U.S. government, where the military is used, number one, for giving people new opportunities where maybe they wouldn't have it, of, hey, you didn't get into this school, but that's okay. We'll accept you into the military, teach you new things, and we'll educate you and give you opportunities and teach you how to function. And that's in peacetime. And in wartime, hey, we basically need cannon fodder. We need someone to fight for our nation and frequently die for our nation. You want as many people as possible. So if under those circumstances where you want to help people, and particularly in wartime, you want people to fight for the defense of your country, you really, really want everyone possible. And yet, despite that motivation of wanting everyone possible, below an IQ of 83, you're deemed not even suitable for that. And
why is that?
So part of the reason is because at that level of intelligence, it takes so much effort to be able to get someone up to speed. So, for instance, handling a gun.
If someone's acting as cannon fodder, why does it matter how long?
Because below that level of IQ, or at that intelligence level, the amount of time that it takes you to learn how to handle a gun at all is multiple times as long as someone of even average intelligence. That your ability to learn the new information becomes more of a burden on the people that are trying to teach it, and such a burden that it impacts the rest of the group. That you need to spend so much time with a person like that it's just no longer worth teaching them, because it's a waste of everyone else's time. And along with that, let's say you do get to them to the point where they have basic knowledge on how to interact with a firearm. If they're particularly around lethal means, they may act poorly around that. So if they find a grenade, They may know, hey, this is going to do something, and they may start playing with that, and they put other people at risk. And that's something that has happened. There were examples of this in Vietnam, and one of the reasons that, I believe one of the reasons that IQ tests started to be used, or at least measuring intelligence started to be used in the military, is because there were instances of people with very low intelligences in the military that ended up killing their own friends, not maliciously, but accidentally, because they were interacting with things that they didn't know how to safely interact with, and teaching them how to safely interact with it was too burdensome and too time consuming, and so it was never done.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people out there that, even when just trying to teach them basic things of, hey, look at this box. If there is a hole in this box, I want you to pull it off to the side because it's a bad box. It needs to be taken off the assembly line. Well, what do you mean by hole? Because there's a hole in the top of the box. That's how things go in. Okay, well, what size of hole? If there's a big hole or a small hole, you need to be able to differentiate between that. And I'm just pulling out a random example here. But as you get to the really low ends of the intelligence spectrum, that is the type of thing that would actually be really difficult. Measuring quality of a box may be difficult for a portion of the population. So if having an IQ test that measures that, and if you score so poorly that we basically say, there is literally nothing that we can teach you such that you'll be useful for the economy or useful for society, what do you do with that type of person? And I think that although it is not an argument against the IQ test itself, while there is something to be said for, hey, there are some really stupid people out there, measuring and knowing about that stupidity, I would contend, is a good thing. Even if it means that we would say to that person, hey, you are really stupid. You cannot, we don't expect you to contribute to society in any way. It's not nice, but an IQ test isn't meant to be nice. It's meant to measure your capabilities relative to other people's capabilities.
Do you think that, like, is there a minimum IQ someone needs to be able to sweep a floor?
Yes.
So,
yes, there is. If you have a low enough IQ, you may think that sweeping a floor is pushing broom on floor, and that is not true. Because I can push a broom back and forth, and I can walk around while I do it, but all I'm doing is just pushing dust all over the place.
But does an IQ test actually measure that?
Yes.
So
if I can't figure out that to push a broom that to be able to sweep a floor, that I need to see the pile getting bigger, I need to have a pattern that sweeps out new portions of the floor. If I have such low intelligence that I can't do that, doing an IQ test, I'll basically it'll be equivalent to randomly guessing, because it means that I won't be able to comprehend what the questions are asking me, and it'll be statistical chance. Approximately. And if you look at, all right, you got as many questions right as we would statistically expect you to get, that's telling of you should have gotten more than this based on just randomly guessing. And the fact that you didn't means that you probably have a low enough IQ that we can't place you in anything, because or at least you would need a different test to be more at their level. If you have a test that is built for the average person, or be able to go from, the bottom 10% up to the top 90%, maybe that top 10%, you'll need a different test to be able to differentiate between them more effectively, but you'll be able to differentiate through the middle 80%. Cool. That's what the tests are aimed at. If you just get statistical chance or equivalent to statistical chance, then maybe there's a different test that we need to give you that is simpler to figure out exactly where on the low end of the IQ spectrum you are. Now, there are also statistical anomalies. There was someone that an example of someone that I believe on the ACT, if you randomly guess, you're expected to get like a 12 or a 14.
I think 14 is the lowest score you can get
Uh,
on the
it,
ACT or something like
it's a
that.
score that you would get if you statistically guess. I've known someone that got a 9.
Hmm.
And I think
Okay.
that might be an example not of lack of knowledge, but of, I'll call it anti-knowledge.
Hmm.
That you have learned things so improperly that what you think is right is the opposite of right. One might
Hmm.
say wrong. But that you have learned so improperly that what is wrong you believe is right. And
Hmm.
that's one of the things that can be measured on the test, is that if you consistently score below statistical average, that means that you've learned things improperly. Now,
Hmm.
there may be many reasons for that. That may be because you had bad teachers or malicious teachers, but it may also be that you just have no idea how to interpret information.
Yeah. So statistically, if you just guess on every answer, you would be somewhere between 11 and 13.
Okay, did you just
Um,
look it up?
I just looked it up. Yeah.
Okay, so about a 12. But still, I've known someone who has gotten a 9, which is worse
Mhm.
than statistical average.
That's like if you were to get a 0 on the ACT, you basically have to know what the correct answer is and then just purposely not choose it for every answer. So that's
Quite
impressive.
possibly, or you just may have a lot of anti-knowledge.
Yeah. Or just get really, really unlucky.
I challenge you to go out and get a 0 on an ACT.
Uh, is there an age range for
I have no idea.
when you can take the ACT? Okay.
Anyway, um, so I think that there are people out there that, to kind of bring it back, there
Hmm.
are people out there that can't even sweep a floor without attendance. So, for instance, you may be able to have someone working on a farm, and if you just need muscle, so for instance,
Hmm.
a story, also a movie of Mice and Men. If you just need
Hmm.
someone to be muscle, okay,
Hmm.
point, lift, point to a
Yeah.
different place, put.
Hmm.
That is something that someone of a very low intelligence can understand. Oh, I lift thing up. He's telling me to put it over there. I put. That requires knowing 2 words and the ability to move your body in such a way that you can lift things up. So there are things that can be done, but
Hmm.
lifting and putting are things that robotics are becoming increasingly good at.
Hmm.
And so as automation becomes more and more prevalent in society, the use cases for people of very low intelligence increases dramatically. And by the way, the number that I used previously of an IQ of 83 and below
Hmm.
is not being accepted into the U.S. military. That's about 10% of the population, which
Hmm.
means that even though we want people to be able to fight for our country, if you are in the bottom 10% of the population, you are deemed unworthy to even die for the country because you're more of a risk to the people around you than you would be a help. Now, what we do with those people is reflective on society and not reflective on the test. And I think that's a differentiation that not everyone makes when talking about IQ tests, is that
Hmm.
the test itself is not saying that we should forget about the bottom 10% or forget about anyone or how we should act on it. It's just giving us information on how to act. And I
Hmm.
would contend that more information and knowing more about the world around you and the people that you're interacting with is a good thing, because you
Yeah.
can make more informed decisions, which means that you are more able to recognize what the wrong decisions are. So it increases the likelihood of you making the best possible decision. Is can we think of a reason why knowing more information would be bad?
If you are expected to be cannon fodder, you might question an order that is obviously going to kill you.
Or you may not question it. Maybe you'll just say, "Yeah, okay, I'll go do it."
I mean, but if you have those critical thinking skills and you can take in the information, you know this is just so crazy that you're almost guaranteed to die, and that's the idea, is that you die so that
Sure.
other people can, I guess,
Actually,
live.
that's a very good point of being able to recognize a situation that will put you into that may cause you to die is something that people of higher intelligence will be able to recognize more readily. There was an instance of someone on, I forget exactly who, but someone on death row in the United States
Hmm.
that had, I want to say an IQ of like 20 or 30 is what he was measured at. It was ridiculously low, and they were trying to. He had, I believe, killed someone.
Hmm.
Didn't really recognize that it was wrong, and they tried to explain to him, "Hey, you are going to be executed," and he
His name was
didn't.
Lenny Small.
No, he didn't seem to recognize that he was going to be executed or what that meant.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
understanding death is something that's associated with IQ, and now kids start to understand death as they grow older and as their intellectual capabilities and their mental faculties increase.
Hmm.
So there are adults that have been so dumb that they don't recognize what death is and they can't interpret it. They can't
Yeah.
understand, hey, we're sending you over to die. Now, on the flip side, like you said, if you have very, very smart soldiers, there is a detriment to that because
Hmm.
they may say, I'm not going to go do that. That's a stupid thing to do. That's just going to get us all killed. And the more dire of a situation that you put a soldier into, the lower the IQ necessary for them to be able to recognize, hey, we're just cannon fodder and we're just being sent out here to die.
Right. So like, and right, and so imagining the situation where you, I guess, only accept people into the military that are incredibly intelligent, and then you have a situation like
Where you need
D-Day.
people to die.
Like, no matter what, anyone that looked at D-Day and the plan for it knew that there were going to be massive losses, but ultimately it was needed to be able to get a foothold.
And I believe
So
the
if
people in the back of the boats that were landing there basically said, hey, and told the soldiers, if you don't move forward, you'll be shot in the back.
right, it's
Ba-
like die this way, which is almost 100%, or have the use your small chances
Die raiding the
to
beach
survive.
and it's a 90% chance that you'll die, or
Yep.
we'll shoot you in the back and there's a 100% chance you'll die.
Right.
That in some cases that's what was necessary. And I don't think anyone knows whether or not that actually happened or if
Hmm.
any of them acted on it. It was just that it needed to be there as a motivation to get people to move forward because most people were in those situations were able to recognize, yeah, this is not good.
Yeah.
A lot of us are going to die.
Right. And I mean, it was, I guess, I usually refer to as an acceptable loss or a necessary loss in order to get that foothold and in Central
Right,
Europe
right.
and go.
And going into wartime of casualties and acceptable losses, I think would
Mhm.
probably be a good episode in and of itself. The
Yeah.
ethics of that. But
Yeah.
in terms of tests, yeah. So uh, measuring someone's intelligence, you may exclude people on the low end, but there's also reason, particularly in the military, of excluding people on the high end. And wanting a dumb soldier, maybe, but also wanting you would want smart people in your military to be able to make good decisions. And the
Right.
smarter your average soldier, generally speaking, the more capable they'll be. So there
Yeah.
are reasons to select it. So having those
So,
standardized tests, I think, would still be good. Now, how you act on the tests is something different. But measuring where people are at, I think, is generally speaking a good thing, even if that
mm,
means that some people may not measure up.
yeah.
I guess the question is, and just in general from this episode is it unfair, or I guess it's unfair because you're measuring people and the results will be different, but
Mhm.
measuring people's capabilities and intelligence, their mental faculties, is that something that should be done? That's effectively the question that we've been
I
asking.
mean, ultimately, it is needed in a lot of situations. Like, if you are looking to get a job that requires very strong mental faculties, there is, I mean, you should be able to be tested on those to make sure that you can,
So,
perform before you are then given the responsibilities of
so
such job.
interestingly, at least in the United States, I believe it is illegal to give a person a straight IQ test and use the result of that in hiring decision.
Yeah, but if they're looking to be a computer programmer and you give them a programming test and they do terrible at it, you're like, well, we're not going to hire you.
Generally speaking, the people that do terribly on those tests are going to have lower IQs, but you can't just give them an IQ test because that's testing generalized knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the reason behind that, and there is some validity in it, is that if you are testing someone's general knowledge and general intellectual capabilities, they may not have the general skills. They may be good in a particular field, but if you're testing for general capabilities and you only need them to be good in that particular field, then it's unfair to test the general capabilities of the people versus their specific capabilities. And so you need to generate your own test to measure their specific capabilities as opposed to the general, which I think is the intent behind the forbidding of using IQ tests in the hiring process.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Is that every job has its own requirements, and trying to use purely general, a generalized knowledge test is too general. You need specific testing.
It can cause unfair difficulty for the people that score poorly on generalized tests. So even if an IQ test is the most highly correlated psychological test that we have with in terms of applicability of saying, hey, if you score highly on this, we expect you to do well in these aspects of life. Even if it's the most correlated test that we have in psychology, it is general, which means that there will be people that are good at particular activities that are very bad at general thinking. So if you score badly on a generalized test, you may not be able to get hired anywhere. So eliminating it across the board of saying you can't use general tests for specific actions or specific jobs, it requires that those facilities create a test to measure your capabilities of doing that particular task. In the example of a programmer, you're going to need to be able to know how to program, which is going to generally be correlated with a higher level of intelligence because you need to know how the program is communicating with itself and with other programs. So there's a lot to keep track of. Whereas sweeping a floor, you don't need to know much, and maybe having an interview with the person saying, hey, can you speak to me? Can you understand what I'm saying to you? Okay, you probably know enough to sweep a floor. So the test that the company creates to measure a person's capabilities, it will still be somewhat correlated with an IQ test because the more difficult the task at hand that you're trying to measure, the more closely you're going to be measuring their intelligence. So it's interesting to me that it's forbidden to have an IQ test because you don't want to too generally test people. But at the same time, the more advanced the topic, the more generalized the test is in terms of, or at least related the test is to a person's general IQ. But it does mean that you don't take an IQ test to go become a janitor because the requirements are low enough that they can be determined pretty easily in a conversation with the person. But it does allow that conversation to happen so that the person applying for the job doesn't say, hey, I got an 80 on my generalized IQ test, so that they can't just be immediately thrown out and disregarded.
It forces an aptitude testing more specific to the job you're applying for.
Sure. It forces the employer to determine a specific aptitude as opposed to a general aptitude. And if they want to go so far as to create their own test that measures general aptitude, that's on them, but it's going to be a lot of extra work for simple jobs. So the simpler the job, the less necessary a generalized test is. And I think that that's fair. Even if on the higher end of things, a generalized aptitude test is valuable in employment, because it is necessarily exclusionary of the lower end of intelligence spectrum, forcing employment agencies to create their own tests specific to the thing that they're employing for, as opposed to a general, is somewhat fair so that you don't end up excluding someone just because of their general intelligence because they assuming that they can demonstrate specific intelligence or specific capabilities that are necessary for the job.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily what I originally thought of when I brought up that aspect of it being forbidden, but I guess that seems to make sense. There is an argument for that.
Yeah, that's why I agree with the I guess the way that the U.S. government at least has gone about doing it.
Even if it's
Saying,
useful for the high end things, it is detrimental for the lower end. And when I say low end, I
yeah,
mean jobs that do not require as high of an IQ. That's what I mean
correct.
by lower.
Yeah.
Man, it's really difficult to talk about intelligence and not be denigrating.
Hmm.
And by the way, if there's anyone out there listening that is a janitor, I don't mean to denigrate what you do. It's
Yeah.
incredibly important. So jobs that require or don't require as high of IQs are not unnecessary. They can
Yeah.
be critically important. You know, sanitation in general is critically important to our everyday lives, but it just doesn't require, generally speaking, high levels of intelligence. It doesn't mean that people that do it aren't intelligent. It
Correct.
just
Yeah.
means that they aren't
And
required to
that's
be.
right. And that's a general statement of just because someone is doing a specific job does not mean that they couldn't be doing a different job. It
Yes. Now,
sometimes it's by choice. I mean, I've known a janitor that or a custodian,
mhm.
I think he preferred to be called, that was quite intelligent, and he didn't want to waste his brain power really at work. He wanted to earn a paycheck so that he could go home and do things that he wanted to do. I mean, not really get paid for them, but he didn't want to get home and be burned out in his
Sure.
mental faculties and
A- a-
use them in a different way.
And
So,
sometimes it may just be someone who is in maybe retired, or
mhm,
they just have extra time and they want to do something simple to and cathartic to take up time. So
yeah,
there are definitely examples of people that are smart in fields that don't. So I say janitor because it doesn't require that high of an IQ to, and like he said, even in that example, it's a
mhm,
smart guy, but he didn't want to use his mental faculties on the work. He just wanted a paycheck. So
yeah,
even that is admitting the fact that a low IQ is required for janitorial work. So
mhm.
while you might see smart janitors, it's very unlikely that you'll see a stupid lawyer.
I mean, I hear people call certain lawyers stupid all the time, but it's a different sense.
Right. It's more in I disagree with the result that you're pushing for, but
Hmm.
generally speaking, if you pass the bar in the United
Yeah,
States, the
it's
test to the standardized test to become a lawyer, if you're able to pass the bar, while you may have different political and philosophical positions, which means you'll be arguing for different things, your
mhm,
ability to form an argument is generally very strong, and interpret
yeah.
arguments is very strong. So I stand by my statement. You might see you might see smart janitors, but you're unlikely to see a stupid lawyer.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Okay. I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. What about you?
I think so. So let's try to go back and summarize some of the points that we touched on, because we touched on a
Yeah.
lot. So let's try to summarize the core concepts and some of the axioms.
Mhm,
Um, it, an ideal IQ test or a standardized test is one that is as accurate as possible across a culture. Generally speaking, there will be cultural differences, but
mhm,
standardized tests should be differentiated based on the culture, and the value of the test is based on its repeatability to consistently measure the same person to this in as the same result over
mhm.
repeated takings of the test. So if you take the ACT is good if the same person can take it under the same circumstances with no additional studying, and they get a similar score.
Yeah.
That's what defines a, generally speaking, a good standardized test. Um, it is most useful if it's measuring fluidic knowledge, which is your ability to accrue, interpret, and act on or make a decision on new knowledge. And the cultural aspect that we mentioned is you need to be able to understand certain words to gain that new knowledge. But the number of words that you can understand is also closely related to your fluidic knowledge, because you would have accrued that previously. So if you don't understand the question because you don't understand certain words, assuming the test was made for the culture that you're in, it is reflective of your ability to have interpreted the information in that culture. Along with that, measuring intelligence or measuring people's capabilities, while it means that you're going to determine how people are differently capable, it's necessary to make more educated decisions. And it is a bad idea, particularly for the low end of the spectrum, or jobs that don't require high IQ. I don't want to say require low IQ, because that implies the wrong thing.
Yeah.
For jobs that don't require a high IQ, if you permit companies across the board to use a generalized knowledge test or a generalized IQ test, the people that can do simple tasks may not score well on a generalized test. So preventing companies from using a general test prevents unfair discrimination of people that don't do well on generalized tests, but can do well on specific tasks, even though generalized capabilities is reflective of your ability to do particular tasks. And then again, at the very end, the statement of it's reasonable to find an intelligent janitor. It is very uncommon to find a stupid lawyer.
Yeah.
So, which again just says that there are different capabilities of people, and while you may be overqualified for a position, generally speaking, you won't hold a position long if you're underqualified for it. And it's on the company to create their own test to validate that you're able to perform the tasks necessary for the job. And while on the higher end, the test that's formed is going to more closely measure what your generalized intelligence is. On the low end, the tests necessary to determine your ability to perform certain simple tasks is going to be less correlated with general intelligence. So people on the low end of the spectrum, to the best of people's employment capabilities, will not be entirely forgotten, because they may be able to do those simple tasks. And so not requiring a generalized knowledge is good for not forgetting about people on the low end of the IQ spectrum. So I think I summed up a lot of stuff there. Is there anything else that I missed?
Just a general rule of, like, it goes along with the last thing that you said, but hey, everyone out there, don't judge a person by their choice of job. You never know what's coming.
Absolutely. Even people in a simple job may be incredibly smart.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, thanks everyone for listening.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.